Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we discuss the movie Grosse Pointe Blank 1 minute at a time. I am your co-host Hugh.
And I'm your other co-host, Dev. And on today's show, we're going to be looking at minute 92 as Martin tries to justify his life choices to Debbie.
And joining us today, as he is all this week, Darren Husted of the T. Hanks for the Memories podcast. Welcome back, Darren.
Guys, people joke about doing podcasts. They don't actually do podcasts. Come on. I mean, I know you guys are very flexible, morally speaking, but, I didn't expect you to actually go ahead and do this thing.
I know, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Dev talked about it for so long.
I mean, it did take some work, and yet somehow I managed to actually end up doing it as well. So
yeah, here we are.
Happens to us all eventually. We all eventually end up doing a podcast somehow.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be Dev's first and last, right?
yeah, certainly first and last that I'm actually starring in and producing. I think I've learnt my lesson at this point.
Yeah, guest on mine if I ever get mine started again, right?
For sure.
I mean, you don't want to like, I don't know. I'm trying to think like thematically what would be appropriate, like in terms of like another film that would be kind of like this. But I don't think there is any other film like Grosse Pointe Blank.
There isn't.
It was part of the appeal. I knew it was going to be one and done. Like, I mean, there's the possibility of War Inc., but does it really warrant this kind of attention? I really don't think so, having now seen it, which I hadn't when we started recording this, and I watched it about halfway through, and I'm like, oh no, that's not happening. That's not happening. I mean, how do you make a film with Dan Aykroyd, Ben Kingsley, John Cusack, Joan Cusack in it and make it that bad? I don't know how you do that.
It's a good question. How do you? But then you see, this is the essence of film, and this is why we can do a podcast like this, isn't it? I mean, as a lot of people in the business often say, very few people set out to actually consciously make a bad film. You try and make a film that is worth your time and effort and money, and yeah, you may know when it's going wrong along the way, and you may try to course correct, but ultimately most people start out with the best of intentions because that's how they get the money and they get the people, as you say, the good people, right? Great cast.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it's a shame that it didn't work the way they wanted to, and I think a great deal of that is the compromises of who Cusack went to for the money. So I think that doesn't, as you say, that does not deserve a minute by minute podcast.
Maybe a one-off special at some point if we've recovered
at some
from this
point
one.
If we can ever get Cusack, that would be amazing. Tell us all about it, John.
Oh dear. I think I'd rather have him talk about this film. If I'm honest.
God, yeah, no, absolutely.
But there may be some interesting nuggets in there.
It's funny because obviously, I was talking about the villains in Air Force One being, Kazakhstan.
Yes.
And in War Inc., they have the fake countries of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
So it's like, once you've had 9/11, you've then got to start making up fake countries because you can't risk actually offending real countries. I was going to say, I think I think the reason why John Cusack's career kind of went off the rails a little bit was probably because he hated George W. Bush so much.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Probably in 2002, he was sitting there looking at America being like, what the hell are you people doing? Why is this guy in charge? Like, what is happening? And that probably, straight away kind of made him feel extremely disaffected. And, it's probably telling that, like, the only Grisham he did was the one where it's like, gun manufacturers are the bad guys.
Yeah, good point. Very, very good point, actually.
So, I mean, that feels like it really fits with, like, John Cusack's kind of sensibilities. Is like, they take gun manufacturers to court, even though a lot of it is all about, like, jury selection and all that nonsense. But, like, it's mostly about, I don't want to spoil the twist at the end of Runaway Jury for people, but I will. The twist is he was affected by gun violence, and so he's deliberately swaying the verdict to take down gun manufacturers. So it's really fun because it's like throughout the whole film you think it's all about the, like, who you don't know whose side he's on until the very last moments, where him and who is he with? Rachel Weisz.
Mm,
Yeah.
It's another brunette. Um, they walk out at the end being victorious because obviously they were affected by.
mm.
There's also some great Gene Hackman, Dustin Hoffman scenes in that one.
Mm.
Um,
I mean, this is the thing. Grisham's stuff. I mean, it's not his best novel, but Grisham, the essence, one of the reasons the books work, and why he became so popular so quickly, other than the fact that they really are good pulp, right? They're not. The movies always try to class it up, like courtroom thriller, right? But the books are proper pulpy in a good way. But one of the things I always liked about them was the way he creates really interesting motivations for his lead characters. You want to see the cut and thrust of the wordplay of the court, but actually he always grounds them morally, and that is always an interesting thing to have when you're doing legal drama. I mean, Michael Connolly does, I wouldn't say the opposite, but he goes in a completely different direction with the Lincoln Lawyer. Where you have where what you're seeing how the system actually works, and how compromised people are morally within it. Whereas with Grisham, it's all about people who go in with the best of intentions and or discover how morally compromised it is along the way and try to figure out how to extricate themselves with a good outcome. And that does seem very Cusack. I mean, one thing I met with all these podcasts we've done so far, and I have not mentioned his TV western, The Jack Bull, which is, if memory serves, one of his own productions after this and High Fidelity. But he really works in a Western setting, which is not something you'd expect. I know I've said before, I think he works well in period settings like the 19th century, right? So you can do the Western, but we're so used to seeing him in modern films. And actually, I don't think enough. I like one thing he could have done really well if they'd made it 20 years earlier. There's a TV show that's done 2 seasons on Netflix, and I cannot remember which American channel it was originally, but The Alienist, which is based on a couple of cracking novels by an American military historian, and it's about hunting a serial killer in New York, pre pre Sigmund Freud, pre psychology. So it's any investigation of the mind is not called psychology; it's called alienation. And so the alienist is the person looking into the mind. And the TV version is decent. It's not brilliant, but it's got some good casting, and it's got it's got Elle Fanning, Dakota Fanning, one of the two Fannings, and it's got Luke Evans. But Cusack is the guy I always saw when I read the book. I always saw him as at least one of the characters, because there's a pair of New York cops in there who are basically prototyping forensics, and then there's the journalist, and then there's the journalist is the one actually telling the story, and then there's one other. But the thing is, it's just Cusack somehow. Every time I see him, there's something about the nose that I don't know. I just like a movie like Glory. Matthew Broderick's good in it, but again, Cusack just. I don't know why he just looks more appropriate to me, and I just think that's a thing as well. It would have been nice to see him do a couple more period pieces, and again, stuff like The Raven, I think probably killed that as well. I mean, he seems to have a knack of picking films that make people go, "Yeah, we're not going to do that with you again." It's a bit of a shame.
I mean, I'm disappointed that nobody thought to bring his Richard Nixon back in any recent film. Like we've had a couple of Elvis films. Elvis was
Yeah,
friendly with Richard Nixon. Let's get ourselves a Nixon in there. Let's bring back
that would
John
have been
Cusack.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
I
he,
can
he
see
gave
that.
him he gave him like his little like FBI badge. Like let's have a scene about it. I think in
Yeah,
Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, they said they didn't do that because there was a whole film literally about that, and they were like, we can't. There's no point putting it in
yeah,
like one scene. It's like there's no like if someone's already done like a whole like 100 minutes of movie about it, just let's not do that. And also Michael Shannon, do like
yeah,
let's not try and match that energy.
yeah.
Like
Shannon energy is a whole other thing.
let's just stick to our Elvis, who obviously is an actor who, for some reason, 2 years later is still talking with that voice. I mean, I do love
Yes,
Oscar's like interviews these days. He's still trying to get rid of his Elvis voice, and it's just really funny to see him do that.
he's
Um,
going to be one of those actors who everyone's just going to assume from now on that's how he talks, isn't it?
Do you know? It's funny because like on TikTok, people go crazy at every interview because there are interviews from before he did Elvis where he spoke normally, and then people will be like, "Wait there, that's not his voice," and it's like, yeah, no, his voice isn't Elvis Presley. Like, where did you get that impression? Um, but yeah, so I mean, obviously, kind of morals and motivation work well with this minute because it is literally Martin Blank just being saying to Debbie, who is clearly horrified. She's like, people don't, people joke about horrible things, they don't do them, and then he's just
Mm,
like, well, like that kind of was my job. Like that is what I do. Like, she's
mm,
horrified at like the murder that he covered up with Jeremy Piven and his ever receding hairline, and you know, like like he just sees it as like another day in the job, and it's that kind of casualness. There was a novel by Ben Elton, which was a kind of parody of like Quentin Tarantino stuff, called Popcorn, which was turned into like a stage play and stuff. And in that, there's like discussions about how like in certain films, like hitmen are portrayed as like, oh, like killing somebody is just like getting a hamburger, like it's not anything anyone really thinks that much about. And there's like a film studies guy who's like talking to like these kids who like idolize this Quentin Tarantino alike, and they're like saying, oh, it's all about this, and he's like no, like you like it shouldn't just be casual to be murdering people, and it shouldn't be
no,
funny to be murdering people.
no, no.
Like that should, like, you really, if you see a dead person, it should be traumatizing, and it should be something you think about. It shouldn't just be like a casual gag that you like throw off. um it's an interesting novel because in the end, like, the Quentin Tarantino character gets like taken hostage by some people who are basically the characters out of Natural Born Killers, um,
Mm,
and then kind of forced to murder someone, to show how funny it is. But anyway, yeah. So I think it's like the reaction that Minnie Driver's character has in these minutes is what you would expect normal people to have. And I think it's
well,
interesting that he kind of puts it as like, when he did the psycho valve for the army, they were like, oh yeah, this is a guy who's gonna enjoy killing people and won't be bothered by it. So let's
mm,
start putting him into the kind of programs where he can do that.
mm,
And we won't hear the punchline to the word, but it finishes with ultimately. But we'll get to the punchline in the next episode
yeah,
of like
yeah.
where he goes with that. But yeah, the fact that she is, I think, like you say, he's realized that he doesn't want to do this anymore, and he wants to keep her, and so it's kind of interesting to see him on screen, using that kind of rom-com training to justify something that really can't be justified, but just to try and keep the girl, just to be like,
Yeah.
like trying to explain it away in a way that kind of romanticizes a little bit, like make it,
Mhm.
oh, I joined the army, it was a job, but then they found out I was very good at this thing, and that's
Mhm.
why that became my job. And then she's like, well, that's just horrific. Like, like you're trying to downplay the fact that you enjoy murdering people, but like, don't
Mm.
do that. Like, tell me about these people that you keep murdering. And he's like, oh, well, they're all terrible people. And it's like, that's not going to do it. Like, she's going to
Mm.
need more than that.
Yeah.
But
And
isn't
this
that
is
always the rationale that they
well,
give?
yeah. I think this is the demonstration of how he struggles socially, right? Like he's
Mm.
very good at the superficial social interactions, but as soon as anything that requires emotions is involved, he
Mm.
doesn't give the right answers. And we've seen this with Debbie a few times, right? Where
Mm.
he's tried to make that connection
Mm.
when they've been more distant, and he's always failed. And it's actually generally his interactions with other people that re-endear her to him. Like, when he's being funny in a kind of playing it off way, or just, not actually trying to reach her directly, that he succeeds.
I feel like, given this is 97, I feel like this is one of the earlier examples of something we've seen in film. Like in the 70s, there was a whole wave of Vietnam vets, right? Doing different things, either they're a cop and it's affecting them, or they're a drifter and it's affecting them, or in the case of uh, Rolling Thunder and what's Schrader's other one, Taxi Driver. They're the lone people who will go off on sprees, and there's all this. The approach to PTSD is generally fairly basic. It's pulpy, and then in the 80s we get sort of, they keep examining the Vietnam experience. But once Gulf War One happens, the only things we get are things like this, right? And you've got a more articulate, educated, intellectual generation, you know, who clearly were raised on the films I've just mentioned, thinking, yeah, we should go to war, right? We're the good guys, right? No one can argue with it this time. We're doing the right thing, and of course, the beginning of something like Three Kings, which is genuinely the only other film I can think of that comes close to the tone of Grosse Pointe Blank, and you got that bit at the beginning where the American soldiers are bored and it's supposed to be the ceasefire, and they're looking through their binoculars and they see an Iraqi soldier, and then and they're going to shoot him, and they're like, "Wait, can we shoot him? Should we be shooting him?" And they start asking you around, like, "Guys, are we still killing people?" And it's like a very strange war that they were in. And Martin, this to me feels a little bit PTSD for Martin, right? Like there's yes, it's comedic, and yes, he does it using his rom-com chops, but I feel like part of all of this is kind of something that people, again, the Americans like to worship their hero, worship their military, but once they come home, as we know, support for them drops off, right? Literally, financially, it drops off. That bill John Stewart had to force through Congress, and things like that. I mean, support is, famously, this is a problem with America, is that veterans coming home often feel like there's no support for them, and they're a liability financially. And so I feel like there's a little taste of that somewhere in this dialogue, somewhere in this conversation. This is the conversation between the person who left to defend the country, even though they were appropriate for it and would enjoy it, and the person who's at home who doesn't understand.
Yeah, there's also some interesting kind of choreography and camera work in this minute.
Hmm.
Um, we see Debbie kind of backing up, trying to get away from Martin, and the
Hmm.
camera is over Martin's shoulder at Debbie, but Martin's movement in following her is very like stalker-ish, right? Like it's kind of
Hmm.
a bit of a loping stride as he's kind of keeping pace with her and not giving her that distance. And then we go back to that old standard that we've had with the camera back and forth, where how tightly zoomed in it is kind of relates to like the relationship. And here, the camera zooms out further and further as the minute progresses, instead of generally moving closer as we've seen earlier in the film.
Mm,
But also the camera actually starts at a much bigger distance, and it's a
mm,
zoom shot even when they are close. So that although they're it's zoomed in, the camera is not close to them. They're not really close to each other.
no.
Um,
Despite in the sort of in the crossover between yesterday's episode and today's episode, the bit where he gently wipes her face, right,
right,
and she
right,
accepts that, but then she looks down and sees the gun and freaks out, and it's like yeah, the distance suddenly grows again,
yeah,
and
yeah,
as you
because it
say,
wasn't just self defense, right? I mean,
no.
it was in the moment, which is his argument, but it's not just self defense; it's actually what he does, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think we were saying yesterday about the kind of action films and the American approach to violence on the screen, and it's like one of the things that I wanted to say yesterday that I think is more appropriate as we get further into this film is the fact that this film has a very careful distinction between corny, over the top shootouts, which are Hong Kong stylized, and that one hand to hand scene with Poubelle, which is
Hmm.
brutal and real, and where the violent you see the wound, right?
Yeah,
And it's nasty and it's grim, and that's what Debbie sees, right? The camera is on that wound when she comes into view, right? And then it cuts back to her view of him and holding the pen, but when she comes into sight, the camera's still on, and we realize she sees the whole thing, and it's just, I think that's again what you said earlier, Darren, about trauma, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Debbie is talking to him, and she is in trauma as well at this point.
yeah, and I think as well because she's like seeks the whole thing of like um he deserved it. Like tell me
Yeah.
he did. Like tell me he was attacking you. Like, and he has to kind of be like, yeah, like this is a rare occasion in this film where he's not getting paid to kill someone. It's just because they tried to kill him, and like
That's a really good point.
almost every other killing in this film is, you know, until we get to the climax. almost every other killing in this film is because he's being paid to do it. I mean, the
Yeah.
opening kill where like he
Yeah.
kills the cyclist, but he doesn't kill anyone else
Anyone?
because
Yeah,
he
because
hasn't been
that's
like he's been paid for the
yeah,
cycle. He says, I'm being paid for one job, the cyclist."
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's not his business to then keep shooting, like and it's a nice like obviously you talked about it when it happened, but like it's like such a nicely set up thing where he's like following the cyclist through the wall. Like,
yeah. That's
so, like
beautiful.
he's a professional. Like that's
Yeah,
what he does. Same with like, the guy that where it goes wrong. Like, he shoots him, and then the guy's like, I'll stop doing it, and he's like, it doesn't make any difference. I've been paid.
yeah.
And whereas, when he kills this guy, it's just like he was trying to kill me, so I just had to kill him. Like,
Mm, mm,
it's the
mm.
same with like some of the other shootouts. Like, the way they're shot, it doesn't seem like he's trying to kill anyone. He's just shooting guns to kind of, you know, get people to move out the way.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
like it's not there's
It's
no intent to kill. But yeah, like when he has to stab someone with a pen, then then like obviously it gets very personal and it gets very close, and
yeah,
that's a completely different thing to being paid to kill someone. Like
yeah,
being paid to kill someone, it's always at a distance. It's always well thought out. It's always planned. But when it turns into a personal thing, it's like very close up and
mm,
very brutal. And like you say, they show the aftermath because as a viewer, we've got to be, even though we're on Martin's side, we didn't want Martin to get killed. It'd be a
yeah,
very strange film if an hour in they suddenly killed off, the guy who's on the poster. But we have to have some sympathy with Debbie as well, where she's like,
mm,
what like this is a high school reunion where we were being cute with each other earlier and putting on weird accents and having fun, and now I'm looking at you brutally killing someone and
mm.
completely out of context. Like, Jeremy Piven's like, yes, let's cover up the body. Let's like, he's willing to dive into, like, he finds that exciting and interesting. Whereas obviously it's traumatized Debbie just by this one murder, and he has to reassure her, no, he was going to kill me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm John
But the
Cusack. My name's above the poster. I can't die. I've got to, like I've got to, like, and also the fact that like he's emphasizing like the way he does this professionally is different to somebody just coming at him and trying to kill him. Although obviously,
yeah,
related in a roundabout way.
yeah. There's only one film, and I have thought of this film a few times during this podcast, just because even though this is set in Michigan, it's we keep saying it is filmed in LA, and those of us who know, those of you who know the locations well can spot them occasionally, like the school. But the one of the definitive sunshiny LA neo noirs of the '80s is To Live and Die in LA, and that is the only film I think I've seen where there is a point towards the end where somebody gets off, and I was just like, where does this film go? Because that person was on the poster. Where does this go? What happens next? It's a brilliant, brilliant thing that I don't think anyone else could pull off. And certainly not in something like this where you're looking at it would be so unresolved as well, wouldn't it? Because we're still rooting for Martin and Debbie. Despite everything, we are rooting for these two because there is a rom com happening here as well. Even if right now this moment feels like a not just a dark thriller or neo noir, but like she feels. I mean, that bit you were saying, Dev, where she's retreating and retreating and retreating, the fear in her face and the weirdness of his attempt to try and reassure her with things that are not reassuring. His face, right? He's got a confused face, and you just. I mean, I remember the first time I saw this, and I remember thinking to myself, at this stage of the film, I genuinely have no idea where this is going to go. I have absolutely no idea who's going to do what next. Is she going to try and hit him and run away? Is he going to accidentally kill her or hurt her? Like at this point, I just don't know, and that's such a great thing. I mean, I don't understand people. I love genre films, right? And I love formulas, and I love watching people play with formulas and tweak with them or do them well. But I'll never understand people who are like, man, I don't get this film. I had no idea what was going to happen. Like, yes, that's the point. That's what we watch film for, right? We want to see that moment that you just go, I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes. And I think this is that moment, right? Even more than some of the other moments we've had.
I mean, I will
Yes.
say this is only a year after Scream, so just because someone's on the poster
Yeah,
doesn't
good point.
necessarily mean they're going to get to the end of the
Good
film
point.
But
Yeah.
like I think this would be a very bold move for them to kill off what is effectively the title character this far into the film. But
Yeah.
like you say, yeah, like the way he's holding the gun, there is a possibility it could go off. It could accidentally kill her.
Yeah.
And like as he approaches the door to to kind of gingerly open it and let her in, the safety's going to be off. Like he's not going to that door with the safety on. So I don't know that we ever see him put the safety back on after she's come in. I would expect he would have done it as just a reflex. Like I don't think he would be holding like a loaded gun directly at her with a chance of killing her. But like,
I
yeah,
hope.
yeah, because well, because he's a professional, so you'd expect he would do that without even thinking.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, there is you are like the way it's framed. And I
Yeah.
think there's a bit, obviously there's a lot more of it in the next minute, but like we're hearing his justification and it's not helping her get closer to him. She is literally
No.
taking a couple of steps away as he particularly because and obviously political correctness was very popular in the 90s. The fact that he calls it like moral flexibility is like
Yes.
such like
So funny.
just say you enjoy killing people, like or you don't care about killing people. Like there's a way to say that that's a bit more direct, and I like the way that he's he of kind of the time, the fact that he does kind of say it in such a kind of weirdly coded way of to say, which in his profession you've got to expect that, because obviously there's a lot of times throughout this film where they don't directly say what they're doing. It's always a certain kind of code language just in case someone's listening in.
Mm.
And even when he, we'll get to it at the end of the week, but even when he's talking to Joan Cusack, like he's not saying I'm a hitman, who am I going to kill? Like it's always, assignments and jobs, and like there's always a certain language so that it's never talking about what it is. And obviously he's used to doing that, but then
Yeah.
Debbie's like, what are you talking about? What
Yeah.
like you're saying moral flexibility, and she's like, just tell, like, you're talking about dead people, you're talking about people that you've killed.
Yeah.
Like it's and I think it's interesting that like kind of that's the way he addressed it. And I think obviously as we go through the next couple of minutes, like the more he leans into that, the more he kind of tries to obfuscate, oh my
Obfuscate.
god, yeah, what he's
Oh,
saying. He like it doesn't like make it easier for her, because she's not the
yeah.
person who morally can justify that kind of thing by just changing the wording.
Yeah.
So just a very well written script, and some nice acting from both of the people in this.
Yeah. Well executed. So, well, if you pardon the pun, it's that kind of film, isn't it? That's the sort of pun that just sort of fits the film. It's well executed. Anyway,
Well,
shall we call it there?
this was minute 92 of the Grosse Pointe Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your host, co-writers and co-producers, myself, Dev Sodiger, and Hugh David.
Today's guest, Darren Husted from the T. Hanks for the Memories podcast. Darren, I know you are, like a lot of people, coming to the end of your feelings about social media, but if people do want to check out your work from over the years, where should they go?
I mean, my stuff is now hosted on Pinecast. So I guess if you put Pinecast of my name, you'll see all the various different websites that host all the many podcasts. If you've got an interest in a film called A Talking Cat, and that is a deliberate. It's got a question mark and a 2 exclamation points at the end. If you're interested in hearing people talk about that film, that was the first podcast that I produced.
Mm-hmm.
So go listen to A Talking Cast, which is about a talking cat. Generally, back in those days, you just had to come up with a funny name for the podcast, and that's what sold it. I feel like we've moved on from those days a little bit.
Just a bit.
Yeah.
You can find us at all good podcast players, including the one you're listening to us on, as well as if you want to see us, YouTube. We're also on X and Spotify. In all cases, our handle is at Debi Radio, DEBI Radio, and our website is also debiradio.com. And once more, that is DEBI Radio.
And if you want to talk with us about this film or films in general, you can join us on our Facebook listeners group, Debi Radio 79.5 FM Fan Club.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time. It wasn't a moment, it was a feeling.